thank you for joining me on the Albion Yard YouTube channel. We're back in the man cave and we have in front of us the Rapido Trains Hunslet 16-inch saddle tank locomotive. Now it looks like it's on an angle, and it is. This is the test I've just done to do with the properties of the chassis, to look and see whether it cogs going up and down hills. Now on the first video I thought, looking at the underneath, that the chassis was a fully geared chassis. Now I've done an old school thing and looked at the owner's manual, and it isn't. And in fact I've actually popped the bottom off the loco, and despite that sounding like something from the Viz comic, it is not a fully geared chassis. So it's a sort of a more conventional tower gear arrangement, and it looks like it works very well. So what I wanted to do was to show very quickly how a locomotive that does have the problem with a fully geared chassis works when it's under stress going downhill. And what I have here is a J94, which is one of the old DJM models, and an MDV. The MDV is loaded with car balance weights, and those come to a weight of just under 300 grams, so it's 299 grams. The locomotive is something in the order of 150. So the locomotive is trying to move in the equivalent really of a Coke can, a standard 300ml Coke can. So let's have a quick look and see how the locomotive does, and we should be able to see how the locomotive hunts, because with the fully geared chassis, that was one of the problems that I'd found with it. So I'm going to try sending it uphill to start with. Remember, this has got something like a Coke can behind it. The gradient is a 4% gradient. It's very simply just propped up at one end, so calculating it out, it comes to something like 4%. So we're now going to look at this locomotive as it comes down the hill and see how the chassis is working. So you can see the locomotive is sort of moving in a jerking motion, and that's one of the problems with this particular style chassis. Thank you. I'll have to pick all those up now and come back to the video once I've got all the bits and pieces so I can do an equivalent test. I'll join you shortly. Right, I've managed to find my wagon and all the car balance weights that were in it. So here it is. Here's our 300 grams of car balance weights, and we'll put those on the Rapido Hunslet, and I'll set it off going uphill up this 4% gradient. So nice smooth movement, just winding it up to full speed. So that's full speed. So already very impressive in terms of its performance, bearing in mind that's pushing 300 grams up a 4% gradient. So no evidence at all of any hunting there. So just to remind you, this isn't a fully geared chassis as I thought it was initially. That was an error on my part, just looking at the underside of the locomotive. So again, I'm slowing it down as much as I can. The reason I'm doing that is because that will provoke any gear cogging. And we can see it's moving really smoothly and really nicely. What I'll do is I'll turn the locomotive round so we can see it going the other way, make sure it's not a fluke in the chassis. So again, with the locomotive around the other way, no problems at all. The other test I did was with the locomotive at the other side of the wagon, and I'll do that again, and hopefully we won't get a runaway this time. But if it does, it will be more added entertainment, I'm certain. So the locomotive is now pulling that 300 gram weight. And now letting the weight pull the locomotive down the hill. Again, no problems at all with that. What I'll do is I'll replace the locomotive and put the J94 on again. So as we can see, the traction on this particular model is nowhere near as good as the, in fact, smaller, and it's 20 grams heavier Hunslet, heavier than this J94. And rather than torture it unnecessarily, I'm going to stop it there. Obviously it wouldn't be Albion Yard without any panniers, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put on a 64XX. This has been converted to a 74XX. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pick up the locomotive with the camera. There we go. So that should pan with the locomotive now. So again, this is a standard Bachmann 64XX. Similar sort of weight to the Hunslet. And this one's not quite as good coming down the slope. There is a little bit of jerking there at some points in the revolution, and it does seem to sort of fluctuate, but I've not seen that with the Rapido Hunslet yet. So again, really impressed with this little Hunslet from Rapido. It's got a super chassis and works really, really well. And one final brutal test I'll do with it. I'll get it to push this weight around a curve. Basically just here there is a medium radius point, so I'll get the camera to pick up the locomotive again. So that's done that now, and we'll see how that works around the curve. So there's a little bit of wheel slip there. But again, once it gets back onto the straight track, it's away with no problem. And downhill through curves, so nothing much to complain about there. So what does a 4% gradient look like? Well, I'll just move the camera so you can see it and zoom out a bit, and we'll get down level with it. There you go. So that is in fact steeper than any of the gradients that you'll get from Woodland Scenics. They do 2% and 3%, so this is as I say, very close to a 4% gradient. It's something like 3.9. So quite a test, and quite a weight for the loco to pull. Pleased with that. And what we'll do now is we'll just take the bottom off it and show you the internals of the running gear. Here we are then. I'll look at the soft underbelly of the Rapido Hunslet. This is the three areas that I thought held the gear train, which they don't. When you look at other locomotives like the J94, if you see those sort of bulges, you can usually assume that underneath there is a gear housings, and that's where I went wrong. As I say, I've looked at the instruction manual, and you can see quite clearly the leading axle here, middle axle doesn't have a cog, and the third axle does. So it looks like a tower, and possibly one further cog maybe making a sort of a right angle to put the final drive in. So let's get into it then. 3 screws to undo apparently. This one, and this one. I'm using a decent screwdriver made by Proxon. I'm going to try and do this so that I don't get my hand too much in the way of the camera. So do excuse for a second whilst these come out. That's the first one out. It's going to be quicker if I don't try it and block the camera. That's the third one, and the last one. So that is the 3 screws undone. I've got a very narrow bladed screwdriver here, and it tells you to just gently move the base plate. So there's the base plate, and inside the loco then, again you see quite clearly now, we've got the rear drive here with a single gear, no gear here, no gear here. What is nice to see, separate square horn blocks from brass. It's a split chassis design. You can see down this centre here you've got a gap. That basically means that these two sides of the chassis are inert electrically from one another. If you actually put a piece of metal bridging those two, then the locomotive would short and wouldn't work. But the quality underneath here is really nice to see. So yeah, it's a single drive rather than multiple drive, rather than multiple geared chassis, and in my opinion probably all the better for it. Thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed this short presentation, and hope to see you again soon.